Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Silent Screamer of Navajo Canyon. Spring break was supposed to be an escape, a week of freedom, laughter, and adventure. For Marcus, Beth, Trevor, and Carly, it meant heading off the beaten path. They were the kind of friends who lived for daring trips, who scoffed at the thought of resorts or crowded beaches. The idea to explore a remote canyon in the Navajo Nation had come from Trevor. His uncle, a hiker with decades of experience, had mentioned it once. Beautiful, but eerie. Some places out there feel like they've never wanted company. The group ignored the warning. Eerie was what they were looking for. After hours of driving through barren desert roads, they reached the canyon's edge. It was breathtaking. A sprawling chasm with walls painted in shades of red and orange, carved by centuries of wind and water. They set up camp on a flat plateau overlooking the ravine, the nearest town miles away. No cell service, no people, just them in the wild. As night fell, the canyon transformed. The colors faded into shadow, and the wind carried strange, hollow sounds that seemed to echo endlessly. Beth was the first to comment. "Do you hear that?" she asked, pulling her hoodie tighter around her. "Hear what?" Trevor replied, poking the fire with a stick. "That weird hum, like the wind, but not." The group fell silent, listening. The crackling fire popped loudly in the stillness. But beneath it, there was something else, a faint, low whistle, like someone blowing over the top of a bottle. It wasn't constant, coming in short bursts, almost rhythmic. "It's probably just the wind moving through the canyon," Marcus said, but his voice lacked confidence. Beth didn't push it. None of them wanted to admit it, but the sound unsettled them. They turned in early, hoping to shake off the unease with sleep. Marcus woke first, or maybe he was pulled awake. He couldn't tell. The air in the tent was cold, and the world outside was darker than he remembered. The fire had gone out, leaving only the dim glow of the moon. Then he heard it. Whispers, faint but unmistakable. They drifted through the air like smoke, curling into his ears and coiling around his thoughts. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping, murmuring in a language he didn't understand. "Trevor," he called out softly, but his voice felt swallowed by the dark. The whispers grew louder, coming from the direction of the ravine. Against every instinct, Marcus unzipped the tent and stepped out. The cold hit him immediately, but it wasn't just the temperature. The air felt off, heavy like a storm was about to break. The whispers were clearer now, beckoning him to the canyon's edge. When Beth woke, she noticed Marcus's empty sleeping bag. Panic flared in her chest. She shook Trevor and Carly awake, whispering urgently, "Marcus is gone." The three scrambled out of the tent, shivering in the cold. Beth spotted him first. There, by the edge. Marcus was standing perilously close to the canyon, his back to them. His posture was strange, stiff, like a puppet on strings. His head tilted slightly, as though listening to something only he could hear. "Marcus!" Trevor shouted, running toward him. Marcus didn't turn. His lips were moving, but the words were inaudible. Beth grabbed his arm, jerking him back just as his foot began to slip over the edge. "Marcus, what the hell are you doing?" she yelled, her voice trembling. As she pulled him away, the whispers stopped. For a moment, the world was silent, and they saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a dark, low figure emerging from the shadows of the canyon wall. As it crawled closer, the firelight caught its form, and the group froze. The creature moved on all fours, its limbs impossibly long and bent at unnatural angles. Its head jerked with each movement like a glitch in a video. When it came into full view, Carly screamed. Its face, if it could be called that, was a twisted reflection of Marcus's own, but it wasn't right. The eyes were too large, the mouth too wide, and the skin hung loosely, as if it had been draped over a frame it didn't fit. The thing paused, its head snapping toward them. Then it let out a scream, a shrill, piercing sound that seemed to come from inside their skulls. Trevor grabbed Marcus, who was still unresponsive, and they all ran. The creature didn't follow, but its scream echoed through the canyon, growing fainter, but no less horrifying. They drove back to the nearest town in silence. Marcus slumped in the back seat, staring blankly ahead. When they reached the safety of civilization, he finally spoke. "It knew me," he whispered. "What are you talking about?" Beth asked. "The thing. It knew me. It wanted me to join it." His voice cracked. "It showed me things. Memories. But they weren't mine." Marcus refused to say more, and no one pushed him. The group made a silent pact never to talk about what happened. They didn't report it, didn't share the story with friends or family. But weeks later, Beth couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. She started hearing whispers at night, faint and distant, like the wind over a canyon. And sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she swore she could still hear the scream. Story 2. The Shape in the Cornfield. The farm had been in the Whitaker family for 3 generations. Jack Whitaker loved it. The sprawling fields of golden corn, the way the morning light caught on the dew-covered stalks, and the distant hum of cicadas that filled the summer air. But for the past few weeks, that love had been tested. Something was wrong, and it started with the animals. The first loss had been a goat. Jack found it at the edge of the pasture, its body twisted unnaturally, throat slashed, and eyes wide open as if it had died mid-scream. He'd buried it, chalking it up to coyotes, though the precision of the wounds nagged at him. Then came the chickens, their bodies mangled and scattered around the coop like discarded dolls. It wasn't just the killings. There was a malice to it, a deliberate cruelty he couldn't explain. By the 3rd week, Jack had lost over a dozen animals. His wife, Martha, begged him to call the sheriff or an exterminator, but Jack was a proud man. This was his land, his responsibility. He'd grown up here, fought off predators before, and he wasn't about to let some mangy coyotes get the better of him. So he stayed up one night, rifle in hand, watching over his property from the rocking chair on the front porch. The hours dragged. Midnight passed, then 1, then 2. The farm was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Even the usual nighttime symphony of crickets and owls had gone mute. Jack's eyelids grew heavy, his grip on the rifle slackening. When he saw it, movement in the cornfield. At first, it was just a rustling, subtle enough that he thought it might be the wind. But then he spotted the silhouette. It was low to the ground, darting between the stalks with unnerving speed. Jack squinted through his scope, his heart thudding in his chest. A coyote. At least, that's what it looked like. He lined up his shot, finger hovering over the trigger. But just as he was about to fire, the coyote did something impossible. It stood up on its hind legs. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The creature's movements were wrong, jerky, and disjointed, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Its eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, fixed on Jack with an intensity that made his stomach churn. And then it started to move toward him, weaving through the corn in a way that was both deliberate and chaotic, its form shifting as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Jack stumbled back into the house, slamming the door shut and locking it. He'd never been a superstitious man, but he'd heard the stories. Skinwalkers, shapeshifters, witches that could take the form of animals to wreak havoc on their enemies. He'd always dismissed it as nonsense, tales to scare kids into behaving. But now he wasn't so sure. The creature reached the barn. Jack watched through the kitchen window, his hands trembling as he gripped the rifle. It stood there for a moment, as if assessing the structure. Then it tilted its head back and howled. But the sound wasn't animalistic. It was human. Worse, it was his voice. "Martha, come outside," the creature called, perfectly mimicking him. "Come on, I need you." Jack's blood turned to ice. Martha was upstairs asleep. She hadn't heard it. Thank God she hadn't heard it. He backed away from the window, his mind racing. He needed to wake her, get her somewhere safe. But as he turned toward the stairs, he felt it, a hand on his shoulder. Cold, clammy, and impossibly strong. He spun around, raising the rifle, and fired. The sound was deafening in the small kitchen, the recoil jolting his shoulder. But the creature was gone. The front door hung open, the night air pouring in. Jack stood there, breathing hard, the scent of gunpowder mingling with the faint, sickly sweet smell of decay. The rest of the night was a blur. Jack didn't sleep, didn't dare close his eyes. When the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, he ventured outside, rifle in hand. The barn door was covered in claw marks, deep gouges that splintered the wood. The cornfield was worse. Entire sections of it had been flattened, the stalks pressed down in a perfect spiral, like something massive had landed there. Jack didn't wait for answers. By the end of the week, the farm was empty. He and Martha packed up and moved to a small rental in town, leaving behind generations of history and a lifetime of memories. He sold the property to a developer for half its worth, never setting foot on the land again. But sometimes, late at night, Jack would wake in a cold sweat, the memory of that hand on his shoulder fresh in his mind. And in those moments, he'd swear he could hear it, his own voice, calling to him from the darkness. Story 3. The Hiker's Shadow. Jenna had always loved the wilderness. There was something pure about being alone with the trees, the smell of pine thick in the air, and the whisper of wind rustling through the leaves. She'd hiked dozens of trails over the years, But there was something special about the hidden waterfall in the remote Colorado forest that she couldn't resist. It wasn't on any map. She'd heard about it from an old guide at a nearby lodge who swore it was the most beautiful spot in the region. "But don't go alone," he'd said, his voice lowering. "There's something off about that place." Jenna dismissed the warning as local superstition. She was confident in her skills. She had a compass, a topographic map, and enough supplies to last 2 days if things went sideways. The day started off beautifully. The sun was high, casting dappled light through the dense canopy, and the air was cool and crisp. The trail was challenging but manageable, winding through steep inclines and rocky terrain. Hours passed, and she felt a thrill of accomplishment as she veered off the marked path, her boots crunching through untouched soil. That's when she noticed it, the shadow. At first, it was subtle, nothing more than a flicker at the edge of her vision. She assumed it was her imagination or a trick of the shifting sunlight. But as the hours wore on, it became harder to ignore. The shadow seemed to have its own rhythm, moving out of sync with her steps. She stopped abruptly, her heart pounding. The shadow didn't stop. Jenna spun around, scanning the forest. Nothing. No rustling in the bushes. No distant crack of a twig. Just the eerie silence of the woods. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing. No answer. She shook her head and forced a laugh. "Get a grip, Jenna." Still, unease coiled in her stomach. She adjusted her pack, quickened her pace, and kept her eyes on the trail. By late afternoon, the light had shifted, taking on the golden hue of approaching dusk. Jenna decided to turn back. The waterfall could wait. She wasn't about to risk getting lost in the dark. But as she retraced her steps, the shadow grew bolder. It didn't just flicker, it darted. It moved like a person, but it wasn't shaped like one. Its edges were jagged and blurry, as though it were half-formed, a smudge of darkness against the vibrant greens and browns of the forest. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal or some bizarre trick of the light. But no matter how many times she glanced over her shoulder, the shadow remained just at the edge of her vision. Night fell quickly in the forest, the shadows deepening into a velvety blackness. Jenna found a small clearing and set up her tent, her movements hurried and clumsy. She didn't bother with dinner. Her appetite had vanished. The noises started just as she was drifting off. At first, they were faint, soft rustling, like leaves brushing against one another. But soon, the sound grew louder, sharper. Footsteps. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she sat upright, clutching her flashlight. The footsteps circled the tent, slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. No response. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, all was silent. Then came a soft whisper, barely audible through the fabric of the tent. "Jenna." Her blood turned to ice. It wasn't just her name, it was her voice. "Jenna." The whisper came again, distorted and broken, like an old tape recorder playing backward. She fumbled with the zipper, her hands shaking. The flap came free, and she pointed the flashlight into the darkness. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. It was her, or something that looked like her. The figure stood a few feet away, its posture unnaturally rigid. Its face was an exact replica of hers, but its movements were wrong, jerky, twitchy, as though it were a puppet controlled by invisible strings. The creature tilted its head, its lips pulling into a grotesque smile. "Jenna," it said again, in that warped, broken voice. She didn't wait to see what it would do next. Jenna bolted from the tent, her flashlight swinging wildly. Branches whipped against her arms and face as she ran blindly through the forest, her only thought to get away. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent. "Jenna, don't run." Her lungs burned, her legs screaming in protest. But she didn't stop until she saw the faint glow of the ranger station in the distance. She stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor. The rangers found her incoherent, babbling about shadows and doubles. When morning came, they escorted her back to the campsite. Everything was as she had left it, except for one thing. Carved into the trunk of a tree near her tent were 4 words: "Don't come back. Ever." Jenna never hiked again. Years later, she would tell her story, but few believed her. Those who did claimed she'd encountered something ancient, something that shouldn't be disturbed. And deep in the Colorado forest, the shadow waits, watching for its next visitor.